You saw nothing out there, Miller. Do you understand me? You saw a goddamn ghost? A mirage in the heat. Lieutenant Commander Hayes' voice was a low hiss, more dangerous than the crack of a rifle. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale coffee and something sour, fear. His finger jabbed into Petty Officer Jake Miller's chest, right over the gold trident pinned to his uniform. You say one word, one single word, to anyone about what happened. And it won't just be your career that's over, your family back in Ohio. They live on a quiet street, don't they? It'd be a shame if things got loud. The threat hung in the cold, pre-dawn air of the forward operating base, a venomous promise that coiled around Jake's throat. He could only stare back, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. A rhythm that said run, fight, do something. But his body was frozen, cemented by the ice in Hayes' eyes. The scene dissolves, and we are plunged into darkness. Utter and absolute, the only sounds are the desperate rasp of breathing and the scuff of boots on loose rock. The weight on Jake Miller's back was a crushing, unforgiving anchor. A dead weight, almost. Each ragged breath the man on his shoulders took was a small miracle. A sputtering ember Jake was desperately trying to keep from being extinguished. Commander Elias Thorne, a legend in the teams, was bleeding out all over him. The warm, sticky fluid had soaked through Jake's combat shirt, plastering the fabric to his skin. It felt like a second, grim uniform. 4 hours ago, they'd been outside the wire. Now, the wire was a distant, shimmering dream of safety. The Afghan moon was a sliver of bone in a black velvet sky, offering no light, no comfort. Jake was navigating by memory and instinct alone, his world narrowed to the few feet of treacherous terrain illuminated by the red glow of his headlamp. Hang on, Commander, just a little longer, sir. Jake's own voice was a shredded whisper, swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the desert night. Thorne's body shifted, a groan escaping his lips that was more air than sound. The movement sent a fresh wave of agony through Jake's shoulders and legs. His thighs burned with a lactic acid fire. His back felt like a single, solid knot of screaming muscle. He'd been carrying the commander for what felt like an eternity. The patrol had gone to hell so fast, a blur of confusion, muffled shouts, and the sickening, wet thud of impact. Not gunfire, something else, something worse. The sweat dripping from his forehead stung his eyes, but he couldn't spare a hand to wipe it away. His grip on Thorne's legs was a death grip. He stumbled, his boot catching on a loose rock, and pitched forward. Adrenaline surged through him. He twisted his body, absorbing the impact with his own shoulder and hip, shielding the commander from the blow. A raw, searing pain shot up his side. He bit back a cry, tasting blood on his lip. Not gonna drop you, sir, he grunted into the darkness, forcing himself back to his feet. The world swayed for a moment. He could feel Thorne's life draining away with every step, his breathing growing shallower, the tremors in his body weakening. Time had lost all meaning. 20 minutes, an hour, 3, it didn't matter. All that mattered was the next step, and the next. His muscles screamed for rest, for release, but he couldn't stop. To stop was to let Commander Thorne die, and that was not an option. Finally, through the haze of exhaustion and pain, he saw it, a faint, hazy glow on the horizon. The lights of the FOB, hope, fierce and desperate, flared in his chest, giving his legs a new, albeit shaky, strength. He picked up the pace, ignoring the daggers of pain in his side and the fire in his lungs. The perimeter fence came into view, a stark, geometric shape against the lightning sky. The guard tower loomed like a silent giant. As he staggered toward the main gate, the rhythmic crunch of his boots on the gravel finally registered with the sentries. A spotlight flared to life, pinning him in its merciless white glare. "Halt! Who goes there?" The voice boomed through a loudspeaker, sharp and laced with tension. Jake couldn't answer. He had no air left. He just kept moving, one foot in front of the other, a bloody, sweat-soaked specter emerging from the dark. He could see the silhouettes of the guards now, rifles raised, their confusion turning to alarm. "It's a Miller," he gasped, the words barely audible. "It's Commander Thorne. He's hurt." He reached the gate, his legs finally giving out. He collapsed to his knees, carefully, gently, rolling the commander off his back and onto the dusty ground. The guards swarmed him, their faces a mixture of shock and horror. One of them knelt by Thorne, his fingers searching for a pulse. "Corpsman, get a goddamn corpsman out here now. Medevac, medevac." Jake looked down at his hands, coated in Thorne's drying blood. He saw the commander's pale, slack face under the harsh glare of the floodlights. And then, as the medics rushed out with a stretcher, he looked up, past the chaos, toward the command tent. He could have sworn he saw a figure standing in the shadows, watching. A figure that looked exactly like Lieutenant Commander Hayes. Then, it was gone. The world started to spin, the sounds faded to a dull roar, and Jake Miller finally surrendered to the crushing weight of it all, collapsing into a dark, silent void. The interrogation room was cold, not just the temperature, but the feeling of the place. Gray walls, a metal table bolted to the floor, and a single, humming fluorescent light overhead that cast everything in a sickly, sterile glow. Jake sat on a hard plastic chair, his own uniform now replaced with a sterile set of gray sweats. They'd taken his blood-soaked fatigues for evidence. He was no longer a hero who had carried his commanding officer for miles across hostile territory. He was a suspect. The door opened, and she walked in. She wasn't in uniform. Civilian cloth, a practical blazer, dark jeans. She moved with a quiet confidence that was more intimidating than any drill sergeant's bark. She placed a thin folder on the table and sat opposite him. "Petty Officer Miller, I'm Special Agent Isabella Rossi, NCIS." Her voice was calm, measured. She didn't offer a hand. "I need you to walk me through what happened last night." Jake stared at the metal table. Hayes' words echoed in his mind. "Your family, quiet street. We were on patrol, ma'am," he said, his voice flat, rehearsed. "We were ambushed. Insurgents. Commander Thorne was hit. I carried him back." Agent Rossi opened the folder. She slid a photograph across the table. It was a close-up of Commander Thorne's torso, taken in the med bay. A dark, ugly bruise, perfectly shaped, was blossoming across his ribs. "An ambush," she repeated, her tone neutral. "You see this, petty officer." The base surgeon, Dr. Evans, he's seen a lot of combat wounds. "Shrapnel, bullet wounds, IED blasts," he says this. "This looks less like shrapnel and more like the tread pattern of a standard-issue combat boot." Jake didn't look at the photo. He kept his eyes fixed on the table. "It was dark," he mumbled, "chaotic. I just know he was down, and I had to get him out." Rossi leaned forward slightly. Her eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "Your official after-action report, which, by the way, was filed by Lieutenant Commander Hayes less than an hour after you returned, states you encountered a small enemy patrol, a brief firefight. Commander Thorne was injured in the ensuing chaos. It says you single-handedly suppressed the enemy and carried him back. Makes you sound like a hero, the kind of hero who gets a Navy Cross." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "But that story doesn't fit. There were no calls for support. No radio traffic indicating contact with the enemy. Your weapon hadn't been fired. And Commander Thorne, he doesn't have a single bullet wound or shrapnel injury on him. What he has is a broken jaw, 3 fractured ribs, and a concussion consistent with severe blunt force trauma." She slid another photo across the table. It was Jake's uniform. His knuckles were raw, bloody. "Your hands tell a story, too, a different one. One that involves a fist fight." "I fell," Jake said, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. "When I was carrying him, I fell, a few times." "Right," Rossi said, a hint of skepticism coloring her voice. She leaned back, crossing her arms. "Let's talk about Lieutenant Commander Hayes. He came back to base almost 2 hours before you did. Said he got separated in a firefight and had to circle back. Strange for a SEAL team leader to get separated from his wounded second-in-command, don't you think?" Jake's jaw tightened. It was a confusing situation. "I'm sure it was," Rossi said softly, her voice changing, becoming almost gentle. "Jake, may I call you Jake? You carried a man weighing over 200 pounds, with full gear, for what we estimate to be nearly 5 miles of brutal terrain. You saved his life. Every instinct I have tells me you're a good man caught in something very, very bad. But right now, the only story I have is one that doesn't add up. And when stories don't add up, people like me start filling in the blanks, and I might fill them in wrong." She stood up. "Think about it. We're going to hold you here for now. Obstruction of an investigation is a serious charge, so is filing a false report. She walked to the door, then stopped, her hand on the knob. By the way, who are you protecting, Jake? Because from where I'm sitting, it doesn't look like you're protecting Commander Thorne. The door clicked shut, leaving Jake alone with the humming light, the gray walls, and the crushing weight of his silence. A weight that felt heavier than the commander's body had ever been. The medbay was a world away from the cold interrogation room. It was quiet, filled with the soft, rhythmic beeping of machines that measured life in electronic pulses. Commander Elias Thorne lay on a sterile white bed, his face a swollen, discolored map of pain. And the fourth line snaked into his arm, dripping fluids that kept him stable. Agent Rossi stood by his bedside, watching him breathe. Dr. Evans, a weary-looking man in his 50s, stood with her, holding a tablet. "He's lucky Miller got him here when he did," Evans said, his voice low. The internal bleeding was significant. Another hour, maybe less. He swiped a finger across the tablet, showing Rossi an X-ray. 3 cracked ribs here. The jaw is fractured in 2 places. And the concussion is severe. But what bothers me are the contusions. He pointed to the bruises on Thorne's torso. These weren't random. They're patterned, deliberate. He was kicked, hard, by someone wearing boots. Rossi nodded, her expression grim. He said anything. Only what's in the report. Ambush, insurgents. Evans shook his head. I've been a Navy doctor for 25 years, Agent Rossi. I know what a firefight looks like on a man's body. This was a beating, a vicious one. Just then, Thorne's eyelids fluttered. He groaned, trying to sit up. Easy, Commander, Evans said, gently pushing him back down. You're not going anywhere. Thorne's eyes focused on Rossi, even swollen and bruised. They were sharp, intelligent. Who are you? He rasped, his voice rough from the fracture in his jaw. Special Agent Rossi, NCIS, sir, she said, moving closer. I need to ask you about what happened. Thorne's gaze flickered around the room, then settled back on her. It's in the report. With all due respect, Commander, the report is incomplete, Rossi pressed. Your injuries are not consistent with an enemy ambush. A flicker of something fear, crossed Thorne's face. He tried to speak, but winced in pain. He took a slow, deliberate breath. Miller, he said, the name a painful whisper. Is he okay? Petty Officer Miller is currently in custody, sir, pending this investigation. Thorne's eyes widened, and he struggled to rise again, a fire igniting in his gaze. Custody? For what? For saving my life. For filing a report that doesn't match the physical evidence, Rossi stated plainly. Sir, I need the truth. What really happened out there? Thorne stared at her for a long moment. The beeping of the heart monitor sped up slightly. He was a man famous for his unwavering integrity, a SEAL officer from an older generation who believed in honor above all else. Rossi could see the war happening behind his eyes. The conflict between the code of silence that bound the teams together and the truth that was clawing to get out. It was an ambush, Thorne said finally, his voice firm, resolute. The words sounded like stones being dropped. A chaotic situation, Miller performed heroically. He deserves a medal, not a jail cell. Any discrepancies in the evidence are due to the fog of war. Now, I'd like you to leave. I need to rest. He turned his head away, a clear dismissal. The heart monitor slowed, returning to its steady, rhythmic pulse. He had made his decision. He was sticking to the story. He was protecting the Brotherhood. Rossi stood there for another moment, a mixture of frustration and a strange sort of respect filling her. Commander Thorne was a formidable man, even broken and lying in a hospital bed. He was lying to protect his men from a scandal, to protect the reputation of the SEALs. But in doing so, he was sacrificing one of his own very men who had saved him. As she walked out of the med bay, she knew this case had just become infinitely more complicated. This wasn't just about an assault anymore, it was about a cover-up. And the cover-up went all the way to the top of this team. She pulled out her phone and called her junior agent. Davis, she said, her voice tight. I want you to pull every single file we have on Lieutenant Commander Adrian Hayes. I want to know who he is, where he came from, and who his friends are in high places. Something is rotten here, and I have a feeling he's right at the center of it. Back in her temporary officia cramped, windowless container smelling of dust and stale arrogant Rossi stared at the face on her laptop screen. Lieutenant Commander Adrian Hayes smiled back at her from his official service photo. He was the picture of a modern warrior. Sharp jaw, confident eyes, a chest full of ribbons. He looked like he was born to lead. Agent Davis sat across from her, scrolling through a different file on his own laptop. You were right to be suspicious, boss. Hayes isn't just some guy. His father is Admiral Marcus Hayes. Rossi's head snapped up. The Admiral Hayes? Vice Chief of Naval Operations? The one and only, Davis confirmed. The man is a living legend at the Pentagon, untouchable, which explains how his son has had a rocket strapped to his back career. Fast-tracked through every promotion, always gets the prime assignments. And a reputation for being reckless, Rossi added, reading from a partially redacted performance review. A few whispers here and there. Pushes the envelope. High risk, high reward operator. Occasional disregard for protocol. It's all phrased to sound positive, but you read between the lines. And you get a guy who thinks the rules don't apply to him, Davis finished. Because for him, they probably don't. Rossi leaned back, rubbing her tired eyes. This explained Thorne's silence. It explained the perfect, prepackaged story. An admiral's son involved in a brutal assault on a decorated commander. The Navy would bury it under 6 feet of concrete to avoid the scandal. Let's go back to the timeline, she said, switching gears. Hayes returns to base at 0200, claims he was separated. Miller returns with Thorne at 0430. That's a 2.5-hour gap. What was Hayes doing? I've been reviewing the FOB's internal surveillance, Davis said, turning his laptop toward her. The cameras cover the main thoroughfares and the entrances to most buildings. At 0215, Hayes doesn't go to the command tent to report the incident. He doesn't go to the medbay to see if Thorne made it back. He goes straight to his quarters. He clicked a key, and a grainy, time-stamped video began to play. It showed Hayes walking quickly down a pathway. He was alone. Now, watch this, Davis said, zooming in. Look at his uniform. Even in the poor light, it was clear. Hayes's uniform was clean to clean. There was no dust, no blood, no sign of the brief firefight and frantic search for his commander that he'd reported. And on his right hand, are those his knuckles? Rossi asked, leaning closer to the screen. Scraped raw, Davis confirmed. He's favoring his right side, too. See how he's not swinging that arm? Could be a sign of bruised ribs. It was the missing piece, the clean uniform, the injured hand. The 2.5 hours he was unaccounted for after returning to base. The story was a lie, a complete fabrication. Rossi felt a cold knot of anger tighten in her stomach. Hayes hadn't been lost. He'd come back, cleaned himself up, and typed up a fairy tale to cover his tracks, leaving Jake Miller to carry the weight both literally and figuratively. Okay, Rossi said, her voice hard as steel. Here's what we do. We need to know where that patrol was supposed to be, and where they actually went. Pull the satellite tracking data from their vehicle and their personal GPS locators. I want a minute-by-minute map of their movements from the moment they left this base. Might need a warrant for that. Bossa Hayes could argue it's classified operational data. Then get one, Rossi snapped. Tell the JAG officer it's for an NCIS investigation into the assault of a senior officer. If they push back, tell them my next call is to a journalist I know at the Washington Post who would love to hear about how an admiral's son is getting special treatment while a young corpsman sits in a cell. Davis grinned. Yes, ma'am. As Davis left, Rossi stared back at Hayes' smiling face on the screen. The confidence in his eyes now looked like pure arrogance. This wasn't just about a cover-up anymore. It was about power, privilege, and a system designed to protect its own. And Jake Miller and Elias Thorne were just collateral damage. Not on my watch, she whispered to the empty room. Not on my watch, you son of a bitch. She knew she was walking into a minefield. Poking a stick at an admiral was a career-ending move. But looking at the file photo of Jake Miller, earnest, his eyes full of the kind of integrity Hayes could only dream of, she knew she didn't have a choice. This was a fight she had to pick. The gray walls of the interrogation room seemed to be closing in on Jake. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the fury in Hayes' face, heard the sickening crunch of a boot hitting flesh, felt the dead weight of his commander on his back. And he heard the threat over and over again. Quiet street, Be a shame if things got loud. The door opened. It was Agent Rossi again. She looked different this time. The professional calm was still there, but underneath it, Jake could see a simmering intensity, a resolve. She didn't sit down. She stood in front of him, her hands on her hips. The official story is falling apart. Jake, she began, her voice low and direct. We have surveillance footage of Hayes returning to base hours before you. His uniform was spotless. His knuckles were bloody. We have satellite data that shows your patrol was miles off your designated route, near a known rendezvous point for local smugglers. A place no SEAL team would go on a routine patrol. She let the facts hang in the air, each one a hammer blow against the wall of his silence. So I'm done asking you about ambushes and insurgents, she continued, her voice hardening. I'm going to tell you what I think happened. You went out there with Hayes and Thorne. But it wasn't a patrol, it was a meeting. Something went wrong. A deal, maybe an argument. And Commander Thorne, being the man he is, tried to do the right thing. He tried to stop it. And for that, Hayes beat him half to death. Jake's face was a mask of stone, but his heart was pounding. She knew. She somehow knew. Rossi leaned down, placing her hands on the table, her face just inches from his. I know you're scared, Jake. I know Hayes threatened you. That's his move, isn't it? He uses his father's power like a club. He makes people feel small, helpless. He makes them believe he's untouchable. Her voice softened again, becoming persuasive, urgent. But he's not. The most powerful men have the furthest to fall. All it takes is one person with the courage to tell the truth. One person to push. She paused. Commander Thorne tried to be that person, and he paid the price. Now it's your turn. Tears pricked at the corners of Jake's eyes. He thought of his parents in Ohio, his sister, just starting college. He thought of the quiet life he was supposed to return to. A life Hayes could shatter with a single phone call. You don't understand, he choked out, the words tearing from his throat. You don't know what he's capable of. Then tell me, Rossi urged, tell me, and we can protect them. We can protect you, but if you stay silent. Jake, if you stay silent, you're not protecting anyone. You are letting him win. You are letting him dishonor everything that trident on your chest is supposed to stand for. Honor, courage, commitment. A SEAL never leaves a man behind. Are you going to leave Commander Thorne behind? Are you going to let Hayes get away with what he did to him? That was the breaking point. Are you going to leave Commander Thorne behind? The question pierced through his fear, striking at the very core of his identity. He had carried his commander's broken body for miles to save his life. Could he now abandon his honor to save his own skin? The dam broke. The story came pouring out, a torrent of shame and fear and rage. It was a deal, Jake began, his voice trembling. Hayes, he was selling military hardware, night vision goggles, advanced scopes. To a local warlord, he'd been doing it for months. Commander Thorne found out. He followed us on the patrol. Confronted Hayes at the meeting. The scene played out in his mind's eye, vivid and horrifying. The warlord's men got spooked. They pulled their guns. Thorne tried to de-escalate, told Hayes he was shutting it down, that he was going to report him. Hayes, he just snapped. He shoved the commander to the ground. He started kicking him, again and again, screaming that he was ruining everything. I tried to intervene. I pulled him off Thorne. He turned on me. We fought. That's how my hands got like this. Then his men pulled me back. He stood over the commander and just kept kicking him. He told me if I ever said anything, he'd have my family killed. He said his father would make it look like a tragic accident. He finally looked up, his face streaked with tears. He left him there to die, Agent Rossi. He got in the vehicle and just left him. I thought he was dead. When they were gone, I went to him. He was barely breathing, so I picked him up. And I started walking. He buried his face in his hands, his body shaking with ragged sobs. He had finally said it. The ugly, terrible truth was out. Rossi stood up, her face a mixture of fury and compassion. She placed a hand on his shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it felt like an anchor in a storm. You did the right thing, Jake, she said softly. You just saved two men's lives, Commander Thorne's. And your own. She turned toward the door, her eyes like flint. Now, it's my turn to fight. The news of Jake Miller's confession spread through the FOB's command structure like a shockwave. It was no longer a rumor or an investigation. It was a confirmed accusation of the highest order. An admiral's son, a decorated SEAL, accused of attempted murder and treason. The pressure on Rossi came down instantly, and it was immense. The base commander, a captain who clearly wanted the whole problem to vanish, called her into his office. He talked about unit cohesion and the delicate political balance of their mission. He suggested that Petty Officer Miller might be suffering from combat stress, that his story was unreliable. Then came the call from Germany, Admiral Hayes himself, his voice a calm, chilling baritone that dripped with authority. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten, it was worse. He spoke of his disappointment that a fine young officer's name was being dragged through the mud by a confused and unstable enlisted man. He spoke of the long-term career implications for an NCIS agent who makes a powerful enemy. He suggested, very politely, that Rossi should drop the investigation before she did irreparable harm to the Navy and to herself. Rossi listened to it all, her knuckles white as she gripped her phone. Every word was a carefully polished threat, but hearing the Admiral's voice, so full of arrogant certainty, only strengthened her resolve. Her next stop was the med bay. Commander Thorne was sitting up in bed when she entered, the swelling on his face having gone down enough that the determined set of his jaw was visible again. He looked at her, and he knew. "He talked, didn't he?" Thorne asked, his voice still hoarse. "He told me everything, Commander," Rossi said, pulling a chair to his bedside. "The deal, the assault, the threats against his family." Thorne closed his eyes, a deep sigh escaping him. It was a sound of profound weariness, of a man carrying the weight of a world he no longer recognized. "I told him to stay quiet, I thought. I thought I could handle it, take a medical retirement. Let the whole thing die, protect the kid. Protect the teams from the stain." By letting Hayes get away with it, Rossi challenged, her voice sharp. By letting him walk free to do it again. "Sir, with all due respect, that's not protection, that's surrender." Thorne opened his eyes, and the fire was back in them. "You think I don't know that, Agent? I've been lying in this bed for 2 days, going over it again and again. My duty to my men. My duty to the Navy. My duty to the truth. And I don't know which way is up anymore. There's only one duty that matters right now, Commander," Rossi said, leaning forward. "Your duty to the man who carried you on his back for 5 miles while you were bleeding to death. Jake Miller put his life on the line for you. Then he put his career and his family on the line to tell the truth. He's upheld every part of the creed. The question is, will you?" She stood and placed a digital recorder on his bedside table. "I have Miller's official statement. It's enough to charge Hayes. But it's the word of a petty officer against a lieutenant commander with an admiral for a father. They'll tear the kid apart on the stand. They'll say he's delusional, that he's lying for a medal. They'll ruin him." She looked him straight in the eye. "But a statement from you. A decorated commander, a legend in the community. That corroborates his story. That's undeniable. That's the truth that can't be buried. Admiral Hayes can't fight that." She let the choice hang in the air between them. The choice to retreat into the shadows of the code of silence, or to step into the light and risk everything for what was right. "A SEAL never leaves a man behind, Commander," Rossi said softly, walking to the door. "I'll be back in an hour." For a long time after she left, Thorne stared at the small black recorder. It was more than a device, it was a crossroads. His entire life, his entire career, had been built on the foundation of the SEAL ethos, brotherhood, loyalty, silent professionalism. To speak out against another SEAL, to air the team's dirty laundry, was the ultimate taboo. But to remain silent now, to let a good man like Miller be crucified to protect a cancer like Hayes, that was a betrayal of everything that ethos was supposed to mean. He thought of Jake Miller's face, young and terrified, but resolute. He thought of the kid's impossible strength, carrying him through that dark, hopeless night. He had trusted Miller with his life. Now, Miller was trusting him with his honor. He picked up the recorder. His hand was steady. He took a deep breath and began to speak. "My name is Commander Elias Thorne. This is my official statement regarding the events of." The arrest of Lieutenant Commander Adrian Hayes was quiet and efficient. There was no grand confrontation. Two armed military police officers, accompanied by Agent Rossi, entered his quarters as the sun was setting. Hayes was packing a bag. He had clearly been tipped off by his father that things were about to go bad. When he saw Rossi, his arrogant smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second. He saw the cold certainty in her eyes and knew the game was up. He didn't resist. He simply held out his wrists for the cuffs, his face a mask of cold fury. The Admiral's power had reached its limit. Faced with the sworn testimony of a respected commander and the damning forensic evidence, even he had to fold to avoid a catastrophic public scandal that would end his own career. The victory was not triumphant, it was sober and heavy with consequence. The story was officially classified, buried under layers of national security to protect the reputation of the special operations community. Hayes would face a court-martial, but it would happen far from the public eye. He would be stripped of his rank and sent to Leavenworth, a disgraced name whispered in the halls of the Pentagon, a cautionary tale of hubris and corruption. Commander Thorne, his testimony given, submitted his request for medical retirement. His physical wounds would heal, but the wound to his faith in the institution he had dedicated his life to was deeper. He had done the right thing, but the cost had been the end of his career and the fracturing of his team. Petty Officer Jake Miller was cleared of all charges. He was offered a medal, the Navy Cross, for his heroism. He quietly declined it. The piece of metal felt meaningless, tarnished by the events that had earned it. The experience had changed him. The simple, black and white world of good guys and bad guys he had once believed in was now 1,000 shades of gray. He finished his tour, but the fire he once had for the teams was gone, replaced by a quiet, weary understanding of the complexities of human nature. When his enlistment was up, he did not re-enlist. He packed his bags and went home to Ohio, leaving the desert and the ghosts of his past behind him. The system had worked, but just barely. Justice had been served, but it felt less like a victory and more like a necessary amputation to save the body from a spreading disease. For Rossi, it was a stark reminder that the toughest battles aren't always fought on foreign soil, against a clear enemy. Sometimes, the most dangerous enemy is the one wearing the same uniform. 5 years later, the mountains of Colorado were a world away from the dusty, barren landscapes of Afghanistan. Here, the air was crisp and clean, smelling of pine and cold stone. A siren echoed through a deep valley, a sound that was urgent but not warlike. Jake Miller, his face now weathered by mountain sun and wind instead of desert heat, rappelled down the sheer rock face. He wore the uniform of a paramedic and a member of the elite search and rescue team. His movements were fluid, efficient, born of years of training in a much different, more lethal environment. Below him, a hiker lay on a narrow ledge, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. A fall. A bad one. "Hang on, buddy, we're coming for you," Jake shouted down, his voice confident and reassuring. He reached the hiker, his medical training kicking in instantly. He assessed the injuries, stabilized the leg, and administered pain medication. The man was scared, in shock, but Jake's calm demeanor was a balm. "All right," Jake said after splinting the leg. "Here's the tricky part. We're going to get you up this cliff. I'm going to carry you. Just relax and let me do the work." He secured the injured hiker to his own harness, a complex system of ropes and carabiners. He took the man's weight onto his own back. It was heavy, awkward, painful, but it was familiar. As his team above began to haul them up, the strain on Jake's back and legs was immense. Every muscle screamed, sweat beaded on his forehead. And in that moment of intense physical struggle, his mind flashed back to another night, another impossible burden, another desperate journey through the dark. He remembered the weight of Commander Thorne, the rasp of his breath, the feeling of his life slipping away. And he remembered the promise he had made to himself that night, "Not gonna drop you, sir." He looked up at the sliver of blue sky visible above the ravine. He had left the SEALs, but he had never left the ethos. He had simply found a new battlefield, a different kind of mission. After the rescue, as the helicopter airlifted the hiker to the hospital, Jake sat on the edge of the cliff, looking out at the majestic, snow-capped peaks. He pulled a worn, faded letter from a waterproof pouch in his pack. It was the last one he had received from Elias Thorne a few years after the court-martial. The old commander was living on a ranch in Montana, his wounds healed, his spirit at peace. The letter was short, but Jake had read it 100 times. "Jake," it said, "I find myself thinking about that night often. I used to think of it as the end of my career. The day the brotherhood broke, but I was wrong. It was the day I learned what the brotherhood really means. It's not about blind loyalty. It's about having the courage to hold each other to a higher standard. It's about being willing to carry the weight when someone else falls. You taught me that. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, I hope you're still carrying people. Not because you have to, but because you can. That's the real mission." Jake folded the letter and put it away. A small smile touched his lips. He was no longer a warrior in the traditional sense. He wore no medals, he sought no glory. But as he stood up, ready for the next call, the next person who needed help, he knew he was still on mission. Commander Thorne would have been proud. True courage isn't always found in the heat of battle. Sometimes, it's in the quiet, agonizing decision to speak the truth against impossible odds. It's in the grueling, anonymous work of saving a single life. The real heroes are the ones who understand that their true duty is to carry the weight of others, no matter the uniform they wear. If you've ever been inspired by someone who chose the harder right over the easier wrong, share their story in the comments below. Your story could be the inspiration someone else needs to hear today. And if you believe in the power of stories like this, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We'll see you next time.